Hi everyone. Here is a recording of a talk I gave last April to the members of Imagery International, in which I take a rather swift and sometimes very brief look at approaches to imagery in Western culture. I hope you enjoy it. Do keep an eye out for other videos I have that explore some of the questions raised in this talk in more depth. Please be aware that this is a recording via Zoom, so the sound quality isn't great in places. It's a little echoey, it's a little loud. Forgive us for that, but I hope the information I provide is nonetheless useful to you. Thank you. I want to give an overview of imagery traditions in the Western culture. I would like to help us discern our lineages in our imagery practice, what we're interested in, what has, informed us, and give us language around this. You have the learning objectives for the CEs, which I'm not going to read to you, but that you will be able to follow afterwards. So imagery in the Western tradition, a sort of a brief history. Holistic Western medicine. This was a general medicine, the way imagery, if you like, was practiced, a huge imaginative background. Aristotle would say things, the soul never thinks without a picture. Right up to the 1700s, you have this idea that a strong imagination creates the event. Earlier European medical approaches were holistic in the true sense of the word. You have a biological and psychological function are governed and performed by what they call the biological soul. In other words, they had a unified view of us. Imagination, along with sensation, digestion, and reason, were among the faculties of the soul. And imagery was regarded as a form of perception. Something happened, you took it into yourself, and you formed an image of it. The imagery was core in how they understood the human being. Emotion and image are things that move the soul. By the Middle Ages, they're locating the imagination as well as reason and as well as imagery. Well, imagination, reason, and thought is all located in the cerebral ventricles. That's how they saw it. And imagination was both the cause and also the healing method for any pathology. And this is fine till we get to the middle of the 1600s, and Descartes begins to put out his ideas. There's a link on this page which you can watch this little video, and it's René Descartes. He was looking for something that could not be doubted. You couldn't trust perception and physical senses. I mean, you look at something, it could be small, you look far away, something could look small, but they weren't small. Could he be sure he was dreaming? No, he couldn't, because he might dream that he's awake. He went into doubt, 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 doubt. Could I trust mathematics? Because he was a mathematician. No, he decided he couldn't trust mathematics. What happens if a demon gets hold of my thoughts and my maths just go wrong? So fundamentally what he came to was the idea that thinking is the only thing he can trust. He might not be able to trust the content of his thoughts, but he could trust the fact that he thought. And so that was where we get the idea of I think, therefore I am, which is his things. And so what this does, like before Descartes, we have this idea of a unified psychophysiological events of the biological soul under us. Images are the products of sensation, and imagery is a perceptual process. And imaginary pain is a felt pain. Imaginary blindness was the inability to see. Disorders of the imagination were both the cause of pathology and melancholy, and all illness is understood at some level as being what we would call psychosomatic, because we human beings are understood as psychophysical beings. And it's psychosomatic without the little edit that we might do that it's not real. I mean, we still get that sense today. So we have the mind-body problem, thanks to Descartes' way of thinking. It spread and it became, I mean, actually it's given us a lot of benefits in science and the way we look at the world and in exploring all sorts of things that we couldn't have done we might have done much slower if we hadn't done this. But it's called Cartesian dualism. It overturned 2,000 years of understanding what we were as human beings. Imagination, passion, reason became faculties of the mind rather than the idea of the more holistic soul. And he put like soul, which was this unifying thing originally, now becomes the mind. And you get mentalism and materialism. You get the idea that, and from mentalism we get psychology, and materialism gives the idea of the mechanical body, which has again brought us a lot of benefit. Surgery, stuff like this. We can talk about viruses. We can understand what this coronavirus is, which we might not have been able to do if we weren't doing this. But there's a lot of disadvantage sometimes because we're trying to bridge that gap the whole time. This is a great quote. The book is Therapeutic Imagery Techniques. It's about 20 years old, but it's a really good book for giving an overview of all the therapeutic imagery techniques. Descartes took the life out of the vital spirits, which was how they imagined the flow through the body, the mind and intelligence out of the body, and as subsequent history teaches, the holism out of medicine. So here, this is the first set of things I would wonder about you considering yourself. Do you understand imagery as a mental function? It's used a lot, the term of mental imagery, but is this where you locate imagery? Have you a sense of humans as psychosomatic beings? Do you have a sense of something more or something unifying in the human? Even if you don't know what it is, do you have that sense? And does your imagery practice focus more on engaging psychology or with the body or with both? So this is some of the questions that this sort of work has raised. And this is looking at discerning where we are in imagery techniques. So I'm going to give the idea that there's two major big categories, and these are enormous categories. So we're not going to go into a huge amount of detail in all of them. You've hypnosis and cognitive behavioral approaches, and then you've psychodynamic, humanistic, and transpersonal approaches. And for me, the little difference is mainly that the categories move from the more practical and functional uses of imagery to the more spiritual and humanist understandings, which you have in transpersonal approaches. Hypnosis. Hypnosis has been around a good long time. It's it was over 200 years old. Franz Mesmer, 1734 to 1815, he gave us mesmerism, which is the basis of hypnosis. And did he use imagery? He did at some level. He had this idea of the animal magnetism going through the body. He certainly had a lot of pageantry around his work. He had machines, and he had, these huge sort of exhibition stuff that went on. His work was regarded a little suspiciously, but what he did give people, or give us still, which is the idea of the induction or the trance methods. In France, which is where a lot of this work was going on, you had two main schools of hypnosis. So you have the Nancy School, which is a hypnosis-centered school of psychotherapy. It felt hypnotic states were healthy states. It was very much in opposition to the hysteria-centered school that was in Paris, which was the work of Jean-Martin Charcot, and which influenced Binet, Janet, Joseph Breuer, who was Freud's teacher, and Freud himself, looked on hysteria, and they looked on hypnosis and hypnotic states as unhealthy states. Because if you think of hysteria and how it was understood, it was like an auto-suggestion of hypnosis. So you have a lot of work going on, and the idea of how they worked with imagery in inducing these hypnotic states. And one of the interesting guys, of course, and you have Émile Coué, who was one of the earliest proponents of self-hypnosis, which is still a major thing in France, more than it is here in the States. And if you've ever used this affirmation, every day, in every way, I'm getting better and better, that's actually his. And, this man was born in 1857, and this work he did continues on. Yoga, if you like, was also regarded as sort of a hypnotic state because of the deep breathing, the coming into body, the animal shapes. You then have hypnosis in the 1920s here in the States. The University of Chicago, Clark Hall, he links it to behaviorism. And then you've Milton Erickson's work, which is, again, has a lot of auto-suggestion and stuff like that in it. And out of that, you get the NLP visualization techniques, the idea of future pacing, desired states. There's a lot of imagery in that. But fundamentally, the hypnosis techniques of imagery includes scripted relaxations, guided imagery using scripts, auto-suggestion and self-hypnosis techniques, including affirmations, and its focus is often on changing behavior or on practical outcomes, if you like. So dealing with self-esteem, anxiety, weight loss. I mean, this is, you know, just the general areas: phobias, panic attacks, sports performance, depression, stammering, things that can be changed. They're life processes that can be changed. Similar techniques are described by, say, the scripts that Jean Achterberg, Barbara Dossi, and Leslie Kochmeyer had in Rituals for Healing, a book they published in 1994. If you need a resource for imagery scripts, it's a very good one. It's looking at major life patterns, and also the scripts developed by Dr. Jerry Epstein for health in healing visualizations, creating health through imagery. Neither, I would say, of those groups of people were solely in this place of looking at changing behavior, changing life patterns, but they did certainly do this. So this is basically some of the idea of using scripted imagery, and it comes from the schools of hypnosis and has roots that go back at least 200 years, almost 300 years in places. I'm going to do a quick little dip into behavioral psychology because this is an American psychology, much more popular in America than it was in Europe. And it's based on the 1913 publication of John Watson's classic paper on What's a Behaviorist, and B.F. Skinner's work in the 1930s all the way up to the 1970s. So it isn't interested in your internal states. It's the easiest way to say it. It's a learning theory that focuses on observable behavior, and it then is working on how that can be changed. It's uses learning through association, rewards and punishment, aversion therapy. So it leads to cognitive behavioral approaches in imagery. So the cognitive behavioral would be imaginal exposure for treating anxiety, trauma, phobias, obsessive compulsive disorder, panic attacks, PTSD. What the two principles that cognitive behavioral work will base themselves on, at least one version of the principles they use, is that the imagined situations sufficiently approximate actual feared events, so that imagining results in an approximation of the avoidant response. In other words, our brain and ourselves act similarly when we imagine the thing we're afraid of as the actual real life encounter with that thing. However, also the imagined situation provokes a lesser fear response than the actual experience, so therefore it can be more readily managed, and the client or the patient, whichever term people decide to use for this, can actually learn how to deal with it. So they have techniques that involve imagining a trigger, learning to cope with it in an imaginal situation. So the easiest one to see that with is something like a phobia. If you have a phobia around spiders, if you imagine the spider and then you deal with it in your imagery, you end up learning how to deal with it in real life. There's also the rehearsal idea, the rehearsal of real life situations. If you have a phobia about public speaking, you can rehearse it. It leads into the sports medicine field where there's rehearsal of actual performances that goes on. And then image habituation training, which is a more detailed, there's different ways of doing it. And one of them is the idea that you record, the patient records how they have, what the trauma is, what the thing is, and then they play it back. And each time they play it back, you deal with the images and the fears that have arrived, and eventually it lowers, it desensitizes the person to the actual real life events. So that's how cognitive behavioral techniques use imagery. So this is a question about where you stand then. Do you use imagery for healing illness and for changing life patterns? Is this where your imagery practice is? Do you use imagery scripts? Do you use self-hypnosis techniques and affirmations? Do you use imagery to rehearse situations? Is your practice focused on creating and supporting practical changes for yourself or your clients? If they are, then you have some linkage to these ways, to hypnosis, to cognitive behavioral ways of working with imagery. So then the larger and the bigger questions start arising when we look at psychodynamic, humanistic, and transpersonal approaches. Fundamentally, what these are saying is rather than focusing on behavior, these approaches focus on insight, awareness, consciousness, and even spirituality. These approaches include Freudian analysis, what are called the oneirotherapies, which is French dream therapies, but they're not actually dreams as in dream therapy itself, but they're more waking dream therapy, Deswale's work, people like that. Ira Progoff's intensive journaling, the deep imagery work of E.S. Gallegos, that's the work I do. Psychosynthesis, Jungian psychotherapy. All of these are in that field of psychodynamic, humanistic, and transpersonal approaches. So we'll dip briefly in here. So depth psychology started in the late 19th century, late 1800s, into the 1900s. You have Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Yolanda Jacobi, Marie-Louise Malfrance, Eric Newman, and more recently you have people like James Hillman. You've numerous post-Jungian and post-Freudian ideas. And then you also have, which I think is important to be aware of, there was a certain amount of scholarship, and this had a huge influence in Europe, where you have Henri Corbin, an Islamic scholar. His thing was the imagination is the primary means to engage with creation. And his work influenced especially James Hillman's archetypal psychology, but also lots of other post-Jungian teachers, and he remains a major influence with imagery work in Europe. Psychoanalysis. This is Freud's work. And this is some of the work I think most of us, I suspect some of us get into this, that we're interested in the hidden structures and processes of the mind. This is what Freud was interested in. He has given us language that we use, like anal personality, libido, denial, repression, cathartic, Freudian slip, neurotic, unconscious, subconscious, ego, id, Oedipal. All of those words are being used every day in normal language, and this all comes from Freud's work, which tells you the sort of influence he's had. What he was interested in was the idea of the unconscious mind. So he gave us the image actually of the iceberg, which gets used a lot by people. You have the conscious mind, which is this tiny, tiny bit on top that's floating over the water. The subconscious, he'd say, those are the things we could be aware of if we tried to be aware of them. The unconscious are things that we're not aware of, and indeed some Freudian therapists will say you can't really become aware of them. And then he has the idea of the id, the ego, stuff like that. So you have this sense of the stuff on the top, thoughts and perceptions. Memories and stored knowledge belongs in the subconscious. And then the instincts and sexual aggressive stuff is below that. And our fears, our unacceptable things, the things that we do, the immoral urges, the irrational urges, the things that we might want to push away are below that again. So psychodynamic approaches are all the theories of psychology that see human functioning as based on the interaction of drives and forces within the person. If they're looking at the idea of the unconscious, the different structures of the personality. And it says basically our feelings and motives and decisions are actually powerfully influenced by our past experiences, which are stored in the unconscious. And that's the psychoanalysis would be Freud's own work, and psychodynamic theory is sort of the works that grew out of his, all, includes Jungian work as well. So the focus in this work is the making elements of the personal unconscious conscious. It focuses on unconscious processes as they're manifested in a person's behavior. So it's really interesting in inner life. The goals of psychodynamic therapy are a client's self-awareness and understanding of the influence of the past on the present. It can be strongly determinant depending on the person who's working with you, as it views our behavior as caused entirely by unconscious factors, over which we have little or no control. But one of the ways Freud, for instance, really used it, because you're there, what he had to pay attention to, if you have this idea that there is stuff that's really underneath your behaviors and what you're doing in your life, how do we access it? And he would have regarded things like a Freudian slip is a glimpse into that unconscious world. So was something like a dream. And he would actually say dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. So dream interpretation in Freud's work is a really important psychoanalytic technique. The content in a dream, which he would call the manifest content, stands in for latent content, which is the idea that it stands in for the unconscious. Whatever the unconscious is trying to communicate to the conscious self, this is the latent content. And his way of working with it was free association. It's the classic Freudian thing of you lying down on the couch, the person is there, you start with an image that you've had in your dream, and you free associate. And there are some standard symbology that's involved in this. If you find yourself interested in this, you can have the idea that men are represented by houses with straight walls. Women could be represented by things you cling to. And you can see how the image could work like that. Something you cling to could be something like you're clinging to your mother, or the nurturing thing that you need. Lots of stuff about phallic symbols, swords, balloons, rockets. There are lots of things that can become phallic symbols, while the womb symbols can be containers or enclosed items. You could have imagery, if you dream of a king, it could be that you dream about your father and your mother as queen. Now, Freud wouldn't have said, absolutely, this is this, is this, is this. But he would have said, once the client starts free associating, they're probably going to end up making these associations eventually. So it's an imaginative process, but it's one that's done very linguistically, and people are just, you lie there, and the therapist is more a listening thing, that he's the person or she's the person who encourages you to free associate. And it's literally a stream of consciousness of images that come. On the other hand, sort of at the other, almost very close to Freud in one sense, but also at another end of what we look at if we're thinking of how do we practice our imagery, we have what's called analytical psychology by Carl Jung. So he died in 1961. He believed most of our sufferings arise from the distresses of the human soul, which he used the Greek word psyche for this. Now, Freud isn't so much into the human soul. He was very much into what's happened in your past. What has happened in your childhood and in your past that's affecting your life now. Jung's viewpoint was a much bigger and broader viewpoint, which some people agree with them, some people don't. But he gave us words as well and language like complexes, archetypes. These are in everyday speech. These two men had a huge impact on how we understand ourselves. Freud had the idea of the personal unconscious. He called it the unconscious. Jung would have called it the personal unconscious, but he also had the idea of the collective unconscious underpinning all of that. He had the idea of the numinous, the spiritual experiences people have, the persona, shadow. How many times do we start working with shadow, those things that we don't know? Self, extroversion, introversion, individuation, active imagination. All of those come from Carl Jung. And this is his question. It's in 1950s language, so it's not inclusive. So do excuse him and me for reading it in non-exclusive language. The decisive question for man and woman is he related to something infinite or not? That is the telling question of his life. Only if we know that the thing which truly matters is the infinite, can we avoid fixing our interests upon futilities and upon all kinds of goals which are not of real importance. This is in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, which was the last book he wrote. So his question is more about this pull towards the infinite and the future. So the focus for Jungian psychology then is the role of the symbolic and spiritual experiences in human life. It rests on his idea of the archetypes, which are potentials for experience that we are all born with in Jungian terms. And the existence of a deep psychic space or the collective unconscious, which links all humankind. The goal of Jungian analysis is what Jung called individuation, the inner journey and the integration that happens in that inner journey. He does deal with childhood experiences, but he also focuses on the pull to the future. Now, one of his methods of working was Jungian active imagination. So this, while Freud had the idea of the dream analysis and by free association, or even the Freudian slip, if you misused a word and you paid attention to it and you'd started free associating, you would also come to a similar place of recognizing what he felt your unconscious was communicating to you. Jung's active imagination worked a little bit differently. It was a more conscious attempt to communicate. And it was about making by going down into the unconscious. And that was his directionality. You go into the unconscious, and he said, no tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. So he really did believe in delving into the unconscious and finding out what was there. So his methodology for this is a nice one to try. I mean, you can do this at home, because the difference, one of the big differences between Jungian active imagination and Freudian, say, dream analysis or analysis in general, is that the practice of active imagination is not done with a therapist. There's parts of it done with the therapist, but most of it is done by yourself. You can bring the results of your active imagination to your therapist, but fundamentally, it's an activity you do by yourself. So it has 5 clear steps. The first is that you relax and find a focus. Usually it's bringing a dream image to mind, because again, you're dealing with something that they feel is going to present itself to you from your unconscious. It's not something that's, everyday life. It's something that comes, and dreams are one of the ways that they feel the unconscious speaks to the conscious mind. So you relax, breathe, find a focus, bring a dream image to mind. That's the second step. The third step is important for Jungian method, is that you actually allow the unconscious to speak, and you do this by giving the image space to animate. So you're not seeking after it, you kind of wait with it. You just allow it be there till it starts to engage in some way with you. And you can have quite a long and deep, if you like, imagery experience, journey, whatever word you'd like to use with it, and you stay in touch with this image as you do it, but it takes the initial step. It must begin the animation itself. And step 4 is to create an artifact, which means you paint or write, make pottery, draw. Jung used to go and build little stone sculptures out in his yard. There's all sorts of ways, but the idea is, that you make something that's permanent. If any of you have seen the Red Book, Jung's Red Book, this is what he is doing in it. These are his active imagination drawings. So you certainly could dance and you could move and you could do stuff like that too. But fundamentally, it's nice. What he liked someone to have was something they can come back to afterwards. And that's step 5. Take a break. It doesn't really matter too much how long you take the break for. If you looked at, say, the Red Book, which is Jung's collection of these drawings he did around his active imagination technique, he goes away and comes back fairly soon after it, and he goes away and comes back. He comes back another 6 months later, and he still goes into it. And this is the time you spend time with what he called the artifact, or what Jungians called an artifact, where you can interpret and analyze it, perhaps using symbols and mythology to do so. And symbolism and mythology are very important to Jungians because of this. And you can spend a lot of time coming over and back to it many, many times. But there is a process there. So there's 5 steps in it. And it really is important to create something for it which gives you a chance to explore it. Now, I think it's a technique people can use easily enough. Even if you don't call it Jungian active imagination, the idea of creating something and revisiting it and wondering what that communication is about, what you're needing to pay attention to, is actually a really, really interesting way to work with imagery. So the image they use in Jungian analysis is the dream image usually, or something else has caught your attention like that. But of course, you could use probably an image you liked. So again, here are the sort of questions if you're trying to figure out where your practice and your imagery practice works. Do you use terms like unconscious or subconscious or ego, repression, complexes? If you have an understanding of them, you're some way working in the field of depth psychology, psychodynamic theory, humanistic work, and maybe in the transcendental or the in that bigger picture of imagery. And it's not saying that you have to be always in that end, but to recognize that when you do, it might be different to, say, scripted imagery or something like that, or you might have a way that you go between the two. So one of the questions I always wonder about for people is the unconscious a place for you, or is it a process? Are you more aware of the idea that there is a storehouse of images or repressed memories or traumas or whatever you want to put in there? Or is it more a process for you where you have, there are things that I'm unconscious of and there are things I'm conscious of, which turns it more process oriented? Do you find a value in using mythology or symbols to interpret imagery or dream experiences? So if you have an imagery experience or if you have a dream, do you go to the symbolic and the mythological to understand it? Or do you explore it in a different way? And have you a focus in your work? Have you a focus on unearthing the hidden, forgotten, and repressed? If you do, you're working in this area of humanistic psychodynamic stuff. Do you work with the idea of a life path or an inner journey, or an integrative journey? Okay, sorry, I thought there was another line. So those are questions that, if you wonder about where you are, the answer to these, if a lot of them are yes, then you are probably working in this area, and this is where, and you can look at people like Jung or Freud or any of them, James Hillman, Marie-Louise en France, if you have an interest in fairy tales. If you find that you dream fairy tales, she's a good one to go to. Other methods. So these are some other methods that kind of have roots in the depth psychology, but they're like post-Jungian or post-Freudian ways of working. So the oneirotherapies, I love that word. Originally I had an image here of someone sleeping, and then I thought, that's not actually accurate, because even though they call them the oneirotherapies, oneiro is the Greek for dreams, and even though they're calling them the dream therapies, they're actually meaning waking dreams or directed daydreaming, which is Robert de Swelly's work. Now, I'm going to do a little about Robert de Swelly, because if we're members of Imagery International had a long relationship with Dr. Jerry Epstein, and his teacher, Colette, I'm sure I'm going to massacre her name, but Colette Abouker Mouska, she was born in Algeria. She learned from Robert de Swelly, and she still called her method the waking dream method when Dr. Epstein met her. So I'm going to expand a little on his work. You also had people like Virel and Frétini in France who actually use the word oneirotherapy for their method. And again, they're not necessarily doing work with dreams. They're doing more daydreaming idea of imagery experiences in every day with their clients. So I'm going to look at Deswelly's work, because again, I think these things are interesting because they give you a method of working that actually might suit you. You might actually like to do something like this, or to do a version of this, or try a version of this. So his waking dream or directed daydream, the client, the patient, he used the word patient a lot, lies down in a darkened room. Actually, I should have written that down. So in a darkened room, and Deswelly would give an initial stimulus to the patient, and I'll give you these stimulus in a little bit. So he offered him basically an image of some sort. The patient then lets his imagination work on the stimulus and create an inner oniric drama. In other words, an inner imagery journey, an inner daydream, if you want to put it like that. The therapist in this case would sit behind the subject. It's almost a little like the way Freud would set up his work. If you were going to do something like the dream analysis and free association that Freud did, the therapist is not in the visual field of the patient or client. The therapist would sit behind the subject, behind his head, and encourage the patient to explore the heights and depths of this imagery space. Whatever was going on. Every now and again, if they needed to, say, if this person ends up walking through a cave or walking somewhere, he'd say, well, pay attention to what's above and what's below. And then the patient would write a written report later on when he went home, maybe. And it would later be used in a face-to-face session where they would explore this imagery experience a second time. They could explore it numerous times, but they would at least do it twice. Now, these are some of his stimuli. So if you have a client, or you yourself want to confront your more obvious characteristics, then he would suggest that for a man, you imagine a sword. And for a woman, imagine a vessel or container. So the client, the patient, whatever word you want to use for the person undertaking the imagery experience, what Deswelly would offer them is, hey, imagine a sword if you're a man and you're wanting to explore yourself. For a woman, imagine a vessel or container. Now, immediately you can see this, and Deswelly was influenced by Freud and Jung. So you can see that these are very classical depth psychological ideas of phallic symbols or womb container ideas. But this is where he would start. Now, he would not say any more than imagine the sword. So the sword is very individual to the man who's the client. If someone was confronting their more suppressed characteristics, then it's a journey to the depths, a descent into the depths of the ocean. Coming to terms with the parent of the opposite sex, which I find this very interesting, because I just find the idea that perhaps you would, for a man, if you're trying to come to terms with your mother, what you're going to do is go to and descend into a cave and imagine a witch, find a witch. And for a woman, descend into a cave and find a magician. Coming to terms with the parent of one's own sex, you turn that around. The man goes looking for the magician, the woman looks to find a witch. Coming to terms with societal constraints, the descent into a cave to find a dragon. And coming to terms with Oedipal situations for both sexes, you do an experience that starts looking, you move towards the castle of the Sleeping Beauty in a forest. And you can see they're very interesting as little keys into imagery and into imagery experiences. And they are rather classically connected. You can see their connection to Freudian work and their work connection to Jungian work as well. So the other thing which Deswelly also believed is that contact with a mystical light obtained through ascension in an imaginal space was essential. It was an essential healing experience, and it should be undertaken early on in therapy. So it's the idea of moving upwards and towards light. He really felt this would help stabilize and would be deeply, deeply healing for someone. Images of descent, which would lead the subject down through holes in the earth or under the sea to encounter archetypal images of animals and monsters and underworld entities, represented work with the more primitive and instinctual side of the person. And again, he felt this was a little darker and could be a little bit more difficult, but so it would be taking place after the mystical light experiences. And he would encourage the person to confront the experiences with courage. And he was not opposed to having the subject, the patient, the client, destroy his antagonist on occasion if he felt that was needed. So it's kind of directed imagery, but it had a lot of, he had a very specific understanding, and his work was a little bit directed. Virel and Frétigny, who I mentioned as well, they wrote a book that was very important in these sort of therapies in French. Their work would be much less structured than de Soilly's. So de Soilly's just is a particular structured type of experience that he offered people. He had very specific places to start. He also had ideas about up and down and things like that that were important. He also tended to give his subjects a suggestion that when they needed it, they had a magic wand or a sword or something to defend themselves. So he's dealing with, you know, fairy tale images, things like that, but he's not necessarily saying that's what it is, but that's what he is dealing with. While Virel and Frétigny, they didn't do it quite the same way. They would certainly maybe start the work and have an impetus, a stimulus for it, but they left the journey be a little bit more open, or the imagery experience be more open. And they didn't use the magic wand or the magic sword or that sort of imagery as much as de Soilly did. But it's good to know that this is a possibility. So what I would say about this is imagery with starting point. The therapist, the person who is working with the client can offer. So they can often have an initial focus or starting point. The differences can occur around how directed by the therapist the imagery that proceeds from the focus point is. So you can dip into stuff that's almost like guided imagery, or you can have less guided imagery and have it much more interactive and open-ended. They also differ. These imagery techniques that begin with a starting point, they also differ in terms of how interpretive they are of the imagery experience. Whether they decide a sword is a phallic symbol, whether a vessel is always something feminine, whether up means light and down means darkness and dark things. You know, there's all sorts of possibilities in there, and on top of that, how interpretive they are if they then link to mythologies and symbolism. So there's a range of differentiation that can happen there. So other techniques in this field, or at least which I would kind of put into this field of the humanistic, the transpersonal, the psychodynamic work, I would put Karl Happich, German worker, a German therapist in the 20s. Now, his predetermined scenes are things like meadows, mountains, chapel. That's what he used as points of departure. He's regarded as having a very Christian viewpoint, and so his work hasn't been that popular or hasn't really survived as well. But he did use things like giving his clients an idea of where to start. I'm just throwing in the Tsubo imagery. I don't think it actually developed very far, but in the 1990s, it was sort of, I think, sort of an Oriental idea, because Tsubos are Oriental clay, Japanese clay jars, and there's a Tsubo therapy that's to do with acupuncture. So I think this is a really intriguing little thing. It just shows you how much you can actually start imagery from almost anywhere. So what they would suggest, this was a method that said, okay, imagine clay jars buried in the earth, I think, for some of them. So they allowed the number of jars that the client or the patient would see to be spontaneous. You didn't have to say, imagine 3 jars. You just said, imagine a number of clay jars. And they'd say, oh, I see 10, I see 20, I see 5, I see 2, I see 1, whatever it was. And then over a number of sessions, the client would approach the jars, could open them, could look into them, could enter them to exist in that world of what was the jars. And it was the same idea of exploring their unconscious through what came out of these jars as they worked them. I think, Sue and Terry, you can disagree with me, but I think your integrative imagery is also one that is in the humanistic and transpersonal fields.
The work of Dr. David Bressler and Dr. Martin Rossman, interactive guided imagery, are in this field.
I think Maureen Minahan-Jones' MO technique certainly is, because she's looking at opening up and the underpinnings of stuff. What's underneath here? What can I, what's causing this illness? What's going on here? And the work I do, deep imagery work, is developed by E.S. Gallegos. It says anything can be a starting point for imagery. I've written little interpretation, but to be honest, we've no interpretation really going on. And the focus is on building. So we have a sense of what you would call maybe the transpersonal. A focus to build the relationship with your deep aliveness. And then you've psychosynthesis, Roberto S. Gioli's work. I always get stuck on that one. He really had the idea that we had all these sub-personalities and that our goal in life, so he's in the transpersonal end of stuff, is the synthesis of all these personalities, of these sub-personalities. And he uses imagery to do that, and meeting these sub-personalities and working with them and talking to them. So again, for you as practitioners, do you work with the idea of a life path or inner journey? And then how directive are you in how you work with imagery? How free-flowing is the imagery you encourage someone to use? Do you have do's and don'ts? Places you're willing to go and allow your clients to go, and places you would never go? And is there a spiritual component or understanding to your work? And it's not saying there's any one of these things that is right, wrong, or different. I'm not making any judgment on them, but I am saying if you're going to look at how your work is, and there are these great major fields of, if you like, imagery and how they work, well, where are you with it? And what do you feel? I mean, is your work related to something like Jungian active imagination? Or do you work with something like, could you see you're working like Diswelli's approach or Freud's approach? Or do you use imagery scripts and techniques that are more like hypnotherapy, that would be in the hypnosis end of stuff? It's a very big field and I've condensed it. So I'm sorry if I kind of overpowered people, but I did want to get sort of those major fields of imagery to your attention. And then you have the questions for yourself, like, well, where do I work? Even for myself, find it useful to start wondering about, where do I put my work? And who could I learn from? Even as I'm preparing this, I'm going, wow, I think I'd love to just try Diswelli's approach and see where that would bring me with someone. Or where does the active imagination approach of, because it's a nice one where you don't need someone to guide you into it. So that's where I am on those things.
The original recording, which you've just listened to, was recorded on April the 1st, 2020 via Zoom for Imagery International. I apologize again for any sound quality issues that might be in this video. Imagery is a vast world. If any of the approaches here have tweaked your curiosity, well, look them up. There's plenty of resources online. There's a whole world of imagery practitioners who practice varying forms of imagery, and there's a whole world of techniques out there. I myself use deep imagery, the work developed by Steve Gallegos. It's an open-ended approach. I run trainings, workshops, and also work with individuals in this approach. So contact me if you're interested in finding out more. I have tried to provide some resources and also links to information you might find useful. Thank you so much for listening.